what was amazing about Covent Garden really was that the market was like the area's heart, and it beat every day.
You go out with a sack on Saturday and we go around the different stalls and pitches in the market. Have you got any specs, please, Governor? Got any specs? You know, chipped up, bruised apple, or a bad cabbage that needs to be cleaned up. When you got them back, your mother would cut them open, clean out the bad bits and that, and the good bits. It's okay, it's on the table. I mean, we had a big family.
Coming from home to school, all the way down Drury Lane, and going home of an evening probably via the market, and then if there was any fruit on the floor, we would pick that up and be able to eat it on the way home.
Well, the first thing you noticed was the noise, the sounds of all the people, all the traders, and it was just fruit and vegetables, stalls and stalls. People often had like great big barrows, and they used to have the green cloth underneath with all the fruit laid out, and all around it were the warehouses where they used to store all their goods.
It was very congested in the mornings, but about 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock it cleared, and then it became very empty, and then it got very busy in the evening with people coming to the theatres. And for long periods of the day it was wonderfully quiet.
And my flat was £5 a week, and over the road was a garage, and the owners of the cars were paying £100 a week to park their car in the garage. Weird. But I was in a really, really run-down flat then, no carpets. We only had loos in the corridor, which we shared with our next-door neighbour, and a sink, only cold water. It was open to the outside, which means my friend who lived on the ground floor used to have a tramp who used to come in and sleep in their loo every night. And they had to negotiate with the tramp what time they stopped using the loo so he could go to sleep. And it was 10 o'clock.
During the Second World War, when the Germans bombed cities like Coventry, a lot of places were destroyed. And there was a fashion for what was called comprehensive development, which meant you knocked everything down and you put new buildings up. And that was a sort of philosophy which was very popular at the time with politicians and with town planners and with developers, because the developers would make more money out of new buildings, and they thought they'd make more money out of new buildings than restoring old buildings.
For a very, very long time, they decided the market had to move because it was causing too much of a clog in the middle of London. They couldn't cope with all the vehicles going in and out. The streets were getting too busy. They had to move the market out. And it was really a long time before it went, after they decided that.
Because the market was moving, the authorities had considered that they must come up with a redevelopment proposal. And the market occupied about 13 acres. And the whole of the area which they were considering is about 100 acres. So really it was really quite a small patch that actually was physically affected by the move of the market and number of buildings. But then I think the primary reason that it really was being motivated was one of pure greed.
The reason behind the plan, as much of it is today, was to make as much money from an area as possible.
Money. Money. Money.
I would say it's money. Big money.
Greed. Basically greed, I think.
So in just one night, 14 acres of central London was going to be vacated. It's a really, really big area in central London. And the property developers knew that was going to happen, and they were like sharks in those days. They were much more invisible. They'd buy land very secretly, and they'd try and get permission to do things very secretly. And they depended on the fact that no one went to the council buildings to listen to the planning application going in, and them getting permission to do what they wanted to do. And they really were circling around, and you knew they were going to pounce the moment the buildings started to be empty.
Because the Covent Garden plan involved knocking down 2/3 of the area, but it also involved building big roads around the around the edge of Covent Garden, and some of the roads were going to be underground. And so the pedestrians were going to be on the first floor level, separated from the vehicles, and we were a bit astonished.
Because they were going to take away the whole of Maiden Lane, just up the street from here, and make the Strand into a four-way highway.
Now here we are in Tavistock Street on the ground. And if the scheme had gone ahead, there would have been a huge great road underground here, and that hotel, the Waldorf Hotel, would have gone right the way across, and Siddons and Sterling buildings would have gone completely. And at the end of this road, this building here would have disappeared entirely. It would be a sunken road going zapping right the way through it. Terrible.
Well, I was a bit shocked because our youth project had a building in Southampton Street, just around the corner, and someone came round and said, "Do you realise this building's going to get knocked down and it's going to become a ventilation shaft for hot air from the underground roads?"
You've got one road there and one road over there. So one was going to the east, and the other one was going to the west. And this was going to go all the way through Covent Garden, all the way through Seven Dials, through this building, all the way down, knock out a number of theatres, all the way around where we first began at Siddons and Sterling, and a big loop would run parallel to all the big roads around it. And as you can see, in order to build these roads, they had to demolish a lot of buildings in order to do it. And then on the first floor, because the roads were there, up there, where that ramp goes, is where people used to walk. That was the idea. So you would never walk on the road at ground level again, you'd walk in the air. So there you are. That's what we stopped them doing. And now it's just a car park.
It would have been, I suppose, like the city really. Business, commercial business, hotels, nothing for us. Nothing certainly for the local people.
I think it would have been very similar to the Barbican, where you don't see people walking around the streets, it's quite car dominated, and there's very large, big buildings that don't have any sort of, I would say, interface with people that just generally walk the streets.
I think the most appalling part of it would have been the killing off of the community, because the people who were born here, and as you know, there are a lot of people in Covent Garden who are great-grandchildren of people who came over here years and years and years and years ago, and all those people would have been dispersed.
There would have been no local people, no homes for poor people or poorer people, working class people. There would have been nothing.
Well, I was devastated really, because I'd only been here about 5 years before they was talking about knocking it down. You know, my home would have been destroyed.
I thought it was utterly undemocratic that you were going to take land away from people who lived in the area and give it to developers.
What the government was going to do is so crude, so vulgar, so stupid. You just had to stop them from doing it. It was ridiculous that they were dreaming of doing it in the first place.
And I must say I was appalled by what I saw. I didn't like it. And then I began to talk to other people. And then we started a group of us, said we ought to let everybody in the area really know what's happening.
I actually went to a meeting at Conway Hall, and it was there that I learnt so much more about it. I think that's probably one of the first meetings I went to. And there were so many local people there who were up in arms over it. So the fact that so many people were there, and you had people like Sammy Driscoll, who was local to the area, and Johnny Toomey, who were very, very good at getting people together because everybody knew them.
In a way, I was a figurehead because I was a student spending a lot of time on it. But, you know, they could say, oh, this is hirsute, long-haired student rushing around. But there wasn't. There was Austin Williams, and then there was this arch trade unionist, Sammy Driscoll, and then there was this interesting philosopher, Simon Pembroke, and then there was this artist. You know, there was a whole variety of people. Bit of an anarchist bunch, really. It worked really well.
Up with powerful leaders or, you know, dynamic forces. Actually, what was particularly interesting about the Covent Garden movement was how many people were giving the same amount of effort, and the collective effect of that was absolutely amazing. And it was really, everybody was doing a little bit rather than somebody was being a leader, or, you know, they had to sort of give impassioned speeches to get anyone to do anything. We've had a public meeting, everybody turned up.
People got very angry, the more people found out about what the GLC were going to do, the more angry they got.
Marched. Every demonstration, or most of the demonstrations I attended.
I've been active in the community centre as well, doing posters for their events, fundraising, things like that, you know.
Oof, wrote an awful lot of letters, did a lot of marching, did a lot of occupations. I got arrested. I wouldn't recommend that. I saw the Bow Street Police Station prison, or cell. Nice cup of tea they gave me.
I remember old Fred in his shop who was kind of instigator initially because he wouldn't sell his shop. You may have heard about that. He refused to sell his shop to the developers, to the GLC, and that put a stop temporarily to the whole master plan of demolishing Covent Garden.
Well, initially it was just to stop the redevelopment proposals, so to try to say, widening Charing Cross Road and knocking all these buildings down, getting rid of the theatres and all these things was clearly bonkers, and could you please abandon those proposals?
I mean, we squatted, we went on marches, they sold the penny news sheet, and you had to go around doors, knocking on doors for people to buy that.
A lot of the time I was squatting, which means occupying buildings illegally and sleeping in them, partly to do with the fact that there was an awful lot of empty property which you could do, choose to move into, and partly to stop redevelopment plans. So there was quite confrontational, and sometimes it was quite aggressive when the authorities send some pretty heavy people in to throw you out of the building.
And that you haven't got a voice. But we have got a voice. If you stick together, you do have a voice. If you all pull together, like we did, we formed the association and the community centre as a base to sort of fight it, on all different fronts. Doing posters and informing people, tenants associations, it all comes to the fore. And that's the way we actually fought it. You can't do it on your own. They would just walked over us, literally.
John Toomey was chair of the Covent Garden Community Association when I joined them, and he was a terrific orator. He spoke really well, really passionately, because his family had all grown up in and around Covent Garden, around Neal Street, and he really understood, I think, what it was to be part of a community that was being forced out of their neighbourhood.
Also, at that time, there was someone called Brian Anson. He came from the GLC. Now, he was very, very, he was an architect. He worked for the GLC, walked out one day and said, I'm not going to work for these people, what they're doing is wrong in Covent Garden, and came to Covent Garden. And he was a very strong part of why the CGCA was set up.
I got involved with the Covent Garden Community Association. My husband was the vice chair for a while, and then when he got too busy for work, I went on as a member. I would demonstrate, I would go to meetings, I would take around petitions. Everybody was always very active.
Because I ran the community association, I was looking after all the people who had complaints or problems. I once spent two hours fishing someone's false teeth out of an overflow in her sink. It got very exciting. They were about that far down the back of the sink, and in the end I had to make a very clever hook out of a piece of wire and get it up. But by the time I got the teeth out, there were about 4 old ladies sitting behind me. How's it going? I think we're getting so excited about whether I was going to do it or not.
I think it was a long shot because we didn't have any money to spend on the campaign either. And there were people who were going to do the redevelopment who were very rich. They had much more in terms of resource than we did. So, no, we absolutely, I never thought we would win, to be honest.
Yeah, you get like a kind of cleansing of ordinary people out the area for people that got lots of money who can pay rich lawyers to defend their interests, whereas we can't.
Because there was such a big protest in London and people supporting the protest from all over the country, there had to be what was called a public inquiry, which was like a court of law, and there was an inspector and people gave evidence. And when that was finished, the inspector would recommend whether the Greater London Council got the powers to carry out its plan. And I organised 12 witnesses to give evidence at the inquiry. And I was only about 25 I think, I acted as though I was a lawyer, because on behalf of this youth organisation. So we were giving evidence for 2 whole weeks. Council had a very famous lawyer called John Taylor QC, and we started on Monday, and I think on the Wednesday he came up to me after the hearing had ended for that day, and he said, I'd like to invite you all round for dinner. So the Friday evening we all went round to his flat, and he gave us advice on how to help demolish the Greater London Council case, because he didn't believe in it, which is very extraordinary.
And I worked for a thing called the Covent Garden Community Theatre Group, and that used to do shows in the pubs in the area. So the size of the show would be about this big in the corner of a pub. So I'd build a set about that wide, and everybody would hide behind a set unless they were on. And there were lots of music. There was lots of music, and the shows were about an issue in Covent Garden, and it would be a comic view of it, you know, and we used puppets and all sorts of big puppets and little windows had opened, and it was just it's got a lot of gags in it, and it was also sort of I don't know, letting people in the pubs know what the current problems were or what should be changed, things like that.
The key person in saving Covent Garden was someone called Geoffrey Rippon, who became Lord Rippon. He was the Secretary of State for the Environment. He was a government minister. And he made a decision, very, very unusual decision. He gave the council the powers they wanted, these comprehensive development powers, but he also he protected 250 buildings, so they couldn't carry out the plan.
When they listed all those buildings, 250, I thought that's it. Plan's gone, and the plan went out the window.
It achieved the saving of Covent Garden as we know it. Although for a while it wasn't as we know it now. There was a fine time when it was absolutely magic. After the plans had been changed and the conservation area had been established and all the buildings of importance had been listed.
How did I feel? Yeah. Very, very happy that we was all going to be able to stay and live in Covent Garden and hopefully bring our children up to do the same.
Princess Margaret came to use our loo in the community centre the day before we heard that we'd got one, and I thought, I bet that's a good sign.
So the next problem was, what were we going to do with all those buildings that were saved, that were historic, and what use could we use them for? Our main agenda for the area really was, the community was housing for ordinary people. So we did our utmost to try and actually get as much social housing in the area for ordinary people.
The minister was called Geoffrey Rippon, and he agreed to kill the old plan and set up a new one on the condition that we talked to the people of Covent Garden and worked out the new plan with them. We couldn't just sort of, a little group of people say, well, we think this would be a nice thing to do.
And so what happened was that something called the Covent Garden Forum was set up, and the Covent Garden Forum ran from 1974 until 1986, and I was on it the whole time. There were 15 residents elected from the electoral register, and 15 businesses who were elected from the business register, and every single thing the GLC discussed had to come to this body.
We went to every planning meeting, we read every piece of paper, we checked on every detail. It took an awfully long time, and we were just so remorselessly determined to do everything we could.
It did seem that we were fighting every single little detail had to be fought for, to make sure that the integrity of the area was maintained, and most particularly to make sure that there was a place for the people who lived in the area and who, to my mind, actually own the area, even though they don't own the buildings.
Where we were all involved in drawing up the new plan. There was a document called Less Planning, More Happening, which I wrote with Geraldine Peterson from the GLC.
My job title for the GLC was Senior Planner with the Covent Garden team, and we were a small team. I had responsibility for getting local people involved in the new plan so it could reflect what local people wanted.
And what we did was we got the GLC to completely rethink how the area was going to be developed by looking at little tiny sub-areas and by having a new plan that was based on restoring old buildings, conservation. So Covent Garden is probably the most famous example anywhere in England of regenerating an area, bringing jobs in and new housing based on active conservation.
And when I came, the market had closed down, the fruit and vegetable market had closed down, but the development of the area hadn't begun. So it was quite empty and desolate and full of tall buildings and warehousing and not much happening at street level.
Oh, it was rather sad really. I think it was boarded up. It was dark, dank and miserable really.
I remember coming by tube to Covent Garden station and being shocked at not only, well, how quiet it was as quiet as a grave really, and there was no people, no bustle, no traffic.
It was wretched, it was soulless, it was dusty, it was bewildering. Everything that we knew, all the noise, all the busyness, all the traffic, all the apples, all the mentalities, the people, just the sheer buzz stopped.
It was completely empty for 4 or 5 years. Yeah, and it was a good time to be here because we had festivals then. The place is empty, we had it to ourselves.
Although the buildings were all boarded up, there were many other things going on. And curiously, that was the most exciting time for the community because the authorities didn't know quite what to do. And I think it was the first time that the local people really took over. Whereas before, people living in Wild Street Estate here didn't know people living in Charing Cross Road, Sandringham Flats. Everybody began merging and getting together. And that was when we were building gardens. That's when we were building our housing association up, and that's when we were actually physically able to do things.
I'm an artist, so I had a studio in one of the old banana warehouses which overlooked the Japanese garden. And I had a brilliant view of the actual garden being built as well, you know. But it was a kind of I was squatting actually with some students from St Martin's School of Art in that building to use it as studio space. The idea was to keep it open, you know, instead of becoming derelict. We wanted to make use of it, which we did.
Oh, it was amazing, absolutely wonderful, because everybody pulled together to create something, and the garden did that. It brought the community together, and it was also particularly nice for people who worked in the area, you know, and they have a little lunchtime, and they got their nasty homemade sandwich they didn't make very properly in the morning, and they got nowhere to sit and eat it, and they could go to the garden and sit there in a nice atmosphere. And even there were, you know, lots of birds singing and wildlife. It was really good.
It was a meeting place for people with their children. As I said, it was a Japanese garden with a bridge, the ducks, you could have barbecues if it was nice weather. We had live music, and we raised money. There was people with craft fairs and everything else. So it was a good meeting place for people in the area. You know, they knew it was their garden, even though it was only temporary. But it was there, and it was a focal point for the area to get involved in what else was going on.
So it was the process of saying, right, what's the next project? And somebody said, well, we ought to set up a community centre. So Penny Saunders and others, you know, raised money to build a community centre. And then someone said, well, let's take over the Jubilee Hall because it would make a great football, a five-a-side football area. And so there was another project. I think it was quite project-driven, but largely because a lot of people were involved.
The campaigning continued to keep things within scale, to keep it as a neighbourhood and not as lots of big office blocks, which was part of the plan.
I was a person who first opened up the Jubilee Sports Centre building. It was me that went in and cleaned it up. Believe me, it was full of dead pigeons and dust about that thick. All the old bits and pieces the market had left behind, they would have been in it for weeks and weeks, months probably. And I swept the whole place out and set up, we had a five-a-side football match, but we did hope that eventually it might end up as a sports centre, which it did.
Most of the properties around here weren't very, you know, they weren't as they are now. We never had bathrooms and kitchens. If you were living, you just had a really, really small flat if you were lucky. But none of the properties were as they are now. And we were hoping to get better accommodation, better homes for people.
There was very little new development. There was on the Odham site, what we call the Odham site, which was where there used to be the printing press, which moved to Wapping. And what happened was the buildings there were demolished. Well, half the site, which is on Longacre, half the site went to housing, social housing.
The block of flats that I now live in, Odham's Walk, was the first block of flats that was actually built in the area for about 100 years. And we wanted to try and keep the community together by housing local people.
We always had a real problem with Westminster City Council and continue to. They have really a very dictatorial political line on housing. The attitude is that Covent Garden is very expensive land, so why should affordable housing be built? And everything is valued as pounds, shillings and pence, which is a very crude way of running our cities. Camdens claim the opposites, but often do the same.
Central Market Building, for example, there was a policy within that you couldn't have what were called multiples. So you couldn't have Tesco or Sainsbury's or you know, multiple shops. Actually, they had to be small, almost individual retailers. I mean, this is slightly gone now, but that was done to try and create a special character.
So the Royal Opera House needed to have a lot more room. It was just too small. They couldn't give everybody a drink in the interval. They needed new lavatories. They needed just the space, and they had huge plans to extend the building. But they wanted to knock down and demolish the Floral Hall and just do whatever they were going to do. And people felt very, very strongly about it.
In the early days, the Opera House didn't object at all to the redevelopment plans of Covent Garden. You know, they really weren't concerned. They got their patch, that's all they're concerned. They got their land. You know, I'm all right, Jack. And then come the 90s, the late 80s, 90s, they decided they're going to redevelop. And they had this completely mad scheme of using their land, which had been given to them by us, by us taxpayer, to build an underground car park for 300 cars that Westminster City Council demanded, and to build offices in order to finance the improvements. And the arrogance of the English establishment. I mean, these are sort of people of some significance, one is told. Most of them have knighthoods or some kind of status. Put them all together, their brain cells sort of disappeared outside the back door. It took 12 years to sort of endlessly battle and use all sorts of techniques from surrounding the building, having candles and managing to get hold of some files and exposing what they were doing.
We wanted to save the Floral Hall, and we kept objecting to the planning permission, and we kicked up a lot of fuss about it, and we won.
But some people really got under my skin, and I have a suspicion, and I'm proud of it, I got under a number of people's skin.
When the market moved, London Underground wanted to close that tube station. And you think how we had quite a battle with London Underground for them to keep it open, because once it had gone, that would have been it.
The campaign I'm involved in now is actually trying to cut down traffic, because there's much too much traffic and the delivery lorries are far too big. Have you noticed how big they are? Big 18-wheelers, yeah, when they should be medium-sized vans making small deliveries into small streets.
In the end, we got a lot more housing. The population was doubled. We got a lot of social housing, affordable housing, a lot of private housing. We brought back the employment base to the area.
I'm sad that the right to buy, which was the legislation that enabled people to buy the council housing, I'm sad that that came in, because it meant that people, in Covent Garden, some people exercised their right to buy, were able to buy at a very low rate indeed, partly because Westminster were wanting to get rid of social housing in Covent Garden, but it has meant that a section of social housing has disappeared.
The thing that I really am disappointed by is that we were on the cusp of already making a big change for London. While we can congratulate ourselves that the area physically hasn't been despoiled, you can still aesthetically walk through the area and see how interesting it is. What we haven't managed to do is build all the other things that we wanted to do, give us that kind of security in the institutions. We've lost libraries, the schools haven't expanded. So a lot of the, in inverted commas, sort of less financially viable schemes have disappeared. But at the time, the GLC owned something like 20 acres of Covent Garden. We had an agreed plan in the area, you had local support, and you had everything in place to really make something happen in this area. But then the GLC was sold, disbanded by the government for political reasons, and all the land was sold, and all that was gone. And I think the biggest mistake is that we didn't get shrewd enough to realize that in this country you've got to own the land, and you've got to own the land in a cooperative sense. And if you own the land, then you can determine what happens. And if you don't own the land, then you're up to the vagaries of market forces, politicians and all sorts.
But today it's become like a flagship area for companies that want to set up business, really big companies. And in some respects they're kind of spoiling the area, because most of those shops you can see in your high street, whereas Covent Garden in the old days was full of small businesses that made crafts and stuff, even musical instruments. But they've all been forced out because of the flagships have come in, pushed the rents up, and they can't compete.
The GLC, because it owns so much land, could control, to some extent, the activities that took place in Covent Garden, and could protect the theatrical industry and protect specialist industries that wouldn't survive because of market rents. With the demise of the GLC, because all those businesses disappeared and have gone either out of business or way out of central London. So you've lost the vitality and you've lost the colour that used to be here.
But I also think once a lot of people were moved into new flats, perhaps they got a bit complacent. They'd fought the initial plan, had won on the initial plan, had got the new home that they needed. So perhaps we, myself included, perhaps we became a bit complacent, I don't know.
But I think it is a success, The most important thing is that a lot of the people went on living here and really liked the change. A lot of the residents really liked what Covent Garden became, a lot. And are really pleased that it had changed like it had.
So at least we have got, it's a kind of a compromise what we got today. We've got high street suburbia in Covent Garden, but that was the price we had to pay. And we have got some social housing for people that actually live here, which is another plus. But that's the way it goes. Some you win, some you lose.
I can't think that we could have done differently from what we did. I think we did our utmost, so I wouldn't say we failed. We weren't successful in some cases because we were up against, as they say, City Hall. Yeah? We were up against big money, we were up against greedy landlords, and they still are very relevant today, particularly in Covent Garden. But I don't think we failed, we endeavoured. And that's what we still do today. We don't give up.